In 1998, South Park aired a joke about a lawyer who won a court case by ranting about Chewbacca instead of the facts. The joke was so sharp that real lawyers now use its name, the Chewbacca Defense in actual courtroom. That was only the beginning. For more than 15 years, this show kept dragging the justice system onto the screen. Courts, the laws, the police, the spies, and it kept finding the same rotten thing underneath. The system loves to talk about fairness. What it really runs on is performance, money, power, and whatever the people in charge quietly want. Tonight we walk through 10 times South Park put the law on trial, from the O.J. Simpson circus to a real Supreme Court case it called years early, and what every one of them quietly taught a whole generation about how the law works. Welcome to East Park, let's get started. The lawyer who won by making no sense back in 1998, South Park was still a young show. It had been on the air for about a year, and most people knew it for one thing: it was crude. 4 foul-mouthed third graders, a town full of odd grown-ups, and a kid who seemed to die in almost every episode. The art looked like flat paper shapes sliding around the screen. Nobody turned it on expecting smart talk about how the country worked. People watched it to laugh at things they were not supposed to laugh at. Then came an episode called Chef Aid, the 14th episode of the second season. Inside a show built on fart jokes and talking poop, the writers slipped in one of the sharpest jokes anyone has ever made about American court. They did it so fast and so casually that plenty of viewers laughed without fully catching what they were laughing at. That joke is the right place to start, because it is the first time South Park dragged a real courtroom onto the screen and showed the whole thing working backwards. Chef matters here in a way that the other adults in town do not. Most of the grown-ups in South Park are clowns. They panic, they follow the crowd, they make everything worse. Chef was the school cook, and he was the one adult who actually listened to the boy. He gave them real advice. He treated them with patience and warmth. So when the show decides to hurt Chef, it lands harder than it would for anyone else, because he is the closest thing the town has to a decent, steady person. The trouble starts with a song. Years before the episode, Chef had written a song called Stinky Britches, recorded it, and more or less forgotten about it. Then a famous pop singer, Alanis Morissette, put it out as a hit of her own, with her name on it. Chef hears his own song on the radio belonging to someone else. He does not try to ruin her. He does not even ask for money at first. He walks into the record company with one small, fair request. He wants his name listed as the person who wrote the song. That is all. The record company could have simply added his name. Instead, they hire a lawyer and sue Chef. The reason they give is that Chef is bothering them. The lawyer they bring in is Johnny Cochran. To understand why that choice was funny and a little dark, it helps to know who the real Johnny Cochran was. A few years before this episode aired, the country had watched one of the most famous trials in its history. A well-known former football player was accused of killing 2 people. His lawyer was a real man named Johnny Cochran, and during the trial, he became known across the whole country. One thing people remembered most was a line he repeated about a glove found at the scene. He told the jury that if the glove did not fit the man's hand, they had to acquit him, which means set him free. The jury did set the football player free. A huge number of people walked away from that trial with the same uneasy feeling that the case had been won by smooth, clever talking rather than by plain truth. South Park takes that exact man and that exact feeling and turns them into a cartoon. In the episode, Chef has an honest lawyer on his side, Kyle's dad, Gerald. Gerald does everything a person is supposed to do. He stands up and lays out the simple facts. Chef wrote the song. Here is the old recording. Here is the proof that it came first. Clean, true, easy to follow. Cochran does not argue with a single word of it. He stands up, and instead of talking about the song at all, he starts talking about Star Wars. He points to a picture of Chewbacca. He explains in a calm and friendly voice that Chewbacca is a tall, furry creature from one planet, but that in one of the movies, he lives on a different planet with little creatures far smaller than him. And that, Cochran tells the jury, does not make sense. He says it again. He keeps circling back to it. If Chewbacca living on that planet does not make sense, and if even bringing up Chewbacca in a trial about a song does not make sense, then the jury has no real choice. They must side with the record company. And it works. The jury believes him. They find Chef guilty of bothering a big record company. The way the show builds that joke is what makes it land. The cartoon Cochran never shouts. He speaks slowly and warmly, like a man explaining something obvious to a room full of children. The writers let him take his time. While he talked, the camera keeps cutting back to the jury, and their faces slowly go blank and slack, then start to nod along, as if their brains have quietly switched off. The whole trick lives in that calm. A man yelling nonsense is just a crazy man yelling. A man saying nonsense in a smooth, sure, reasonable voice starts to sound like he might have a point, even when every word is junk. The show found the exact thing that makes the joke true and put all its weight there. There is a smaller wink tucked in for anyone who remembered the real trial. Later in the episode, Mr. Garrison drives Chef to a concert in a white Bronco, the same kind of vehicle the real football player rode in during a slow, strange police chase that the entire country watched live on television television. Nobody stops to explain the joke. The car is simply there, sitting in the background, waiting for the people who would catch it. The punishment for losing is its own small joke. After the guilty decision, the judge sentences Chef. He first announces 8 million years in prison before a court worker leans in and quietly corrects him. The real sentence comes out as this: Chef must pay $2 million within 24 hours or spend 4 years in jail. Strip away the laughs and look at what the scene is actually saying. A court is supposed to be the one place where the truth wins. A person walks in, shows what really happened, and the system sorts right from wrong. This scene paints a colder picture. It shows the people deciding a man's fate barely weighing the truth at all. They react to whoever puts on the better performance. Chef had every fact on his side. He had the song, he had the proof. None of it saved him because the other side hired a man who knew how to flood the room with so much confusing noise that the truth got buried under it. The win went to whoever put on the better show. That idea hit hard in 1998 because the real trial was still fresh. It had only ended a few years earlier. Millions of people had watched it stretch across their televisions for months, and a large share of them came away with that same quiet worry that a guilty-seeming man might have walked free because his side was better at talking than the other side was at proving. South Park reached straight into that worry and built a joke on top of it. The joke worked because people already half believed it. The show was saying out loud a thing a lot of adults had been turning over in their heads for years and had never quite put into words. For the younger viewers who had not followed any real trial, the lesson slipped in sideways. They did not pick up the details of a court case. They picked up a feeling. They learned without anyone spelling it out that a smart and smooth talker can beat an honest person, and that grown-up systems built to be fair can be bent by someone who knows the right trick. That feeling sticks, even in a kid far too young to say where it came from. Chef does not give up, and the back half of the episode is about his fight to turn the same weapon around. To raise $2 million fast, he ends up selling himself to the lonely women of South Park. He raises that money for one reason: to hire Johnny Cochran himself and aim the trick back at the people who used it on him. While Chef scrambles, the boys and the rest of the town throw a giant concert to help him called Chef Aid, a copy of the huge real-life charity concerts of years past. Real musicians show up as themselves, drawn into the cartoon, including Elton John, Meat Loaf, Ozzy Osbourne, and others. In one quick gag, Ozzy bites the head clean off Kenny, which is how Kenny dies that week. At the concert, the cartoon Cochran watches the whole town pull together for one good man, and something in him shifts. The show plays the moment like an old Christmas cartoon. It even tells us his small heart grew 3 sizes that day, a line lifted straight from the Grinch. He offers to take Chef's side for free. Back in court, Cochran runs the same play one more time, only now it points at the record company. He brings up Chewbacca again. Then he reaches down, pulls out a small stuffed monkey, holds it up to the jury, and tells them to look at the silly monkey. One juror's head explodes on the spot. Chef wins. The company finally admits out loud that he wrote the song. After the episode aired, the joke did something jokes almost never do. It climbed out of the show and into the real world. The made-up trick had a name inside the episode: the Chewbacca defense. Once people heard it, they kept using it. Real lawyers, law students, and writers began saying Chewbacca defense to describe an actual move, the moment when someone in an argument dumps out a pile of confusing, beside the point nonsense on purpose just to muddle the room and bury the real question. A joke written for a cartoon about a small mountain town handed serious people a word they did not have before. The show reached into the world of courts and gave it a label that stuck. That is the quiet beginning of the pattern that runs through everything ahead. Long before South Park became famous for taking on presidents and giant news stories, it made one simple sharp point about the justice system. The system does not always run on truth. It runs on performance, on who can talk best, confuse most, and look surest while doing it. Chef Aid is the first time the show puts a real courtroom on screen and shows the machine running exactly the wrong way, rewarding the trickster, punishing the honest man, and only setting itself right once that honest man learns to play just as dirty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and the show was only warming up. Pulling off that trick in Chef Aid took a grown lawyer in the shadow of a national trial. In the very next season, South Park would shrink the same idea down to size and hand it to its youngest, meanest character, then watch how fast an entire town turns on itself once a single 8-year-old figures out that the right word, said to the right grown-up, can turn a simple schoolyard insult into a weapon. Section 2. How schoolyard insult broke a whole town. By the summer of 1999, South Park had grown up a little. The show had just put out a full movie in theaters, and the writers came back to television sharper and more sure of what they wanted to say. The first episode to air after that movie was the 6th episode of the 3rd season, and it pointed straight at something the whole country was arguing about back then. People felt like everybody was suing everybody over anything for money. The episode took that worry and pushed it all the way to to the end of the road. It opens in the classroom. Mr. Garrison brings in a guest to teach the kids a lesson, and the guest is a grown man dressed in a big soft panda costume. His name is the Sexual Harassment Panda, and he has a cheerful little song and a friendly voice. His job is to teach a room of third graders about a serious grown-up subject, a kind of mistreatment that adults have real laws about. The whole picture is already a joke before anyone says a word, because a bouncy cartoon mascot with a jingle is the last thing that should be standing in front of small children explaining a heavy legal topic. The kids do not understand most of it. They grab the one piece they can use. Soon after the lesson, Stan gets annoyed and calls Cartman a name. He calls him an ass sucker. On any other day, that is just a normal South Park insult, the kind the boys throw at each other a dozen times an episode. This time, Cartman has just been told that mean words can count as harassment, and that harassment is something a person can be taken to court over. A light goes on behind his eyes. He does not feel hurt. He feels an opportunity. Cartman sues Stan. To do it, he hires a lawyer, and the lawyer is Kyle's dad, Gerald. Cartman wins the case, and the punishment is that Stan has to hand over half of everything he owns. A grown man in a suit walks into Stan's house and starts dividing up a little boy's toys and belongings, because one kid called another kid a bad name after a panda told them names could be against the rules. The show plays it flat and serious, which is what makes it funny and a little sick at the same time. That win is only the spark. Gerald sees how easy it was, and he stops being a normal small-town lawyer. He turns Cartman's tiny case into a giant one and sues the school itself for millions of dollars. Then he does it again and again. He starts taking on hundreds of these cases for kids and for grown-ups, all of them claiming they were harassed by someone, all of them after a payout. The money pours in. Gerald turns his house into a mansion. He becomes the richest man in South Park, and also the most hated and the most feared, because everyone knows that the wrong word in front of the wrong person now means a lawsuit and a stack of money lost. The whole town tips over into madness. Once people learn the trick, nobody can stop using it. Everyone starts suing everyone. A news reporter on television gets sued in the middle of his own broadcast for something he said seconds earlier. Even Pip, the gentle kid the other boys pick on constantly, gets instant on it and sues Cartman for $1.4 million, which is just about the only time that poor kid ever comes out ahead. Lawsuit stacks on top of lawsuit until they pile into one enormous case the show calls Everyone versus Everyone, where Gerald somehow ends up standing in for every single person in town, all of them suing all the others at the same time. The way the episode builds this is steady and patient, like a snowball rolling downhill. It starts small and a little bit silly, one kid and one insult. Each new scene makes it bigger and adds another person who has figured out the game. The cheerful panda song keeps floating in the background, light and harmless, while the thing it set off keeps growing into a monster. That gap between the happy little jingle and the wreckage it causes is where a lot of the comedy lives. The show never winks at the camera or stops to tell anyone how clever it is being. It just keeps turning up the dial. Underneath the jokes, the episode is making a sharp point about how rules meant to help people can be flipped into a weapon. The law the panda teaches was built for a real and serious reason, to protect people from being mistreated. None of that protection survives contact with South Park. The rule is so loose and so easy to claim that anybody can wave it around. A person does not have to actually be harmed. A person only has to say the magic words and find a lawyer willing to push. The truth of who did what to whom stops mattering. What matters is who is quickest to call themselves the victim and reach for a payout. And the people who pay the price are the ones the rule was supposed to protect in the first place. When Gerald sues the school for millions, the school has to actually hand the money over, and a school does not have a secret pile of cash sitting in the back. The money comes out of the classrooms and the lunchroom and everything the kids depend on. The budget falls apart. Chef ends up forced to serve worse and worse food because there is no money left. In the end, the broke school cannot even afford to keep paying the sexual harassment panda, the very mascot who started the whole mess, so they fire him. That is where the episode gets strangely sad. The panda, now out of work and seemingly convinced he really is a panda, drifts off and ends up in a place called the Island of Misfit Mascots, a gloomy little home for unwanted costume characters that nobody needs anymore. It is the show poking fun at the Island of Misfit toys from the old Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special, except here it is full of washed up men in cartoon suits. The boys who have watched their school crumble realize the only person who might be able to stop the lawsuits is the same panda who set them loose. They go find him. While they are out there on the island, one of the mascots accidentally kills Kenny, who dies after grabbing a magnet and getting yanked into a giant spinning fan. The boys talk the panda into coming back, and he returns with a brand new name, Petey the Don't Sue People Panda. He shows up at the giant Everyone versus Everyone case and gives the room a simple talk. He explains that suing each other does not create money out of thin air. The money has to come from somewhere, and where it comes from is schools and parks and the taxes everyone pays, which means it it comes out of the same people doing the suing. There is no such thing as free money, he tells them. Every dollar pulled out in a lawsuit is a dollar taken away from a classroom or a playground and slipped into someone's pocket. He says all of this in his soft panda voice, and it lands. The crowd agrees with him. They decide all these lawsuits really are pointless and harmful. And then comes the moment that says the most about how the show sees people. The instant the townsfolk decide suing is wrong, they spin around and aim that anger at Gerald, the man who got rich off all of it, and they threaten to sue him. Gerald does not put up a fight or defend himself. He immediately agrees that being sue happy is terrible and drops every single case on the spot. He does not stop because he learned a lesson about right and wrong. He stops the second the weapon gets turned around and pointed at his own pile of money. The country watching in 1999 knew exactly what the show was laughing at. That stretch of years was thick with famous lawsuits and a loud, constant argument about whether America had become too quick to drag everyone to court. People traded stories about silly cases and huge payouts over small things. One of the biggest news stories of the time was a lawsuit aimed at the President of the United States himself, and harassment law sat right in the middle of the national conversation. South Park took that whole mood, the sense that the rules were getting vague and easy to abuse, and turned it into a town eating itself alive over a panda song. The kids watching, the lesson slid in the way these lessons always do, sideways and without a label. They were not learning the details of any real court case. They were soaking up a feeling about how the world works. They learned that grown-up rules can be played like a game, that the loudest person calling themselves a victim can walk away with the money, and that a system built to keep people safe can be twisted into a tool for robbing them. They also picked up something darker about people watching the whole town only quit cheating once the cheating threatened the cheater. This connects right back to where this all started. In the courtroom from the first case, Gerald was the honest lawyer. He stood up, told the plain truth, laid out the facts, and lost to a man running a slick trick. One season later, Gerald has become the trickster. The system did not punish the dishonest move he lost to before. It rewarded that move so richly that even the honest man threw away his honesty to grab a piece of it. That is the same point the show keeps making, dressed in a panda suit this time. The justice system does not reward the person who is right. It rewards the person who learns to work it, and it pulls good people toward the gaming instead of pushing them away from it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In both of these cases though, the weapon was money. A clever lawyer or a clever kid could empty a person's wallet, take their toys, or bankrupt their school. Losing hurt and it cost a fortune, but the people on the wrong end of it all walked out of the courtroom and went home. The show was about to find a higher gear. In its next swing at the justice system, the thing on the line stops being money and starts being freedom when a single rock thrown on a snowy hill turns one 8-year-old boy into the center of a courtroom that wants to lock him away for years. Section 3, How a Thrown Rock Became a Hate Crime. The year 2000 was South Park in full stride. The show was in its 4th season, confident and quick on its feet, and it had started building whole episodes around the arguments the country was having that very week. That spring, it ran a short string of episodes with the year 2000 stuck in their titles, and the second of them did something the show had never quite done before. It took the worst person in the entire cast and turned him into the one the law treats unfairly. That choice is the key to everything in this episode. Cartman is, by a wide margin, the cruelest, greediest, most hateful kid in town. He says vile things. He treats people like dirt. He is racist on purpose and proud of it. A writer who wanted an easy, comfortable story about unfairness would pick a sweet, innocent character to wrong, somebody the audience already loved. Parker and Stone did the opposite on purpose. They built the whole thing around the one boy nobody wants to defend and then dared the audience to defend him anyway. It starts on a snowy hill. The girls of South Park Elementary, led by a sharp-tongued girl named Lizzie, challenge the boys to a sled race down a slope the show calls Phil Collins Hill. The boys are sure they will win, and there is a simple reason for their confidence. Cartman is heavy, and his weight on the back of the sled makes it shoot downhill faster than anyone else can manage. He is their secret engine. The name of the hill is its own quiet joke, by the way, because around this time, the show had started a long-running grudge against the musician Phil Collins after his song beat the South Park movie song at the Oscars. Even the setting is a jab. The trouble begins the way most fights between 8-year-olds begin, with name-calling. Token, the only black kid in town, and a character getting his first real spotlight in this episode, keeps poking at Cartman about his weight. Cartman, already short on patience, warns that he will throw a rock at the next person who calls him fat. Then Kyle, off to the side, mutters the insult anyway and calls Cartman a fat ass. Cartman boils over and hurls a rock in a blind rage. The rock sails off and hits Token in the face, giving him a black eye. Kyle is stunned because the whole thing happened in a second over a tired old fat joke. So far, this is an ordinary playground mess, the kind a teacher sorts out before lunch. Cartman gets sent to Mr. Mackey's office and lands 2 weeks of detention, which is about right for beating a classmate with a rock. The matter is nearly settled. And then the door opens and 2 FBI agents walk in. The agents announce that the rock throwing is not a simple schoolyard fight anymore. Because the boy who got hit is African American, the whole thing is now being treated as a hate crime, a much more serious kind of crime. They place Cartman, an 8-year-old, under arrest right there in the principal's office. The jump from after-school detention to federal agents in handcuffs happens so fast that it knocks the air out of the scene, which is exactly what the show wants. One moment, the punishment fit the crime. The next, grown men in suits are hauling a child off as if he were a national threat. What follows is a full courtroom story, and the show plays the circus around it perfectly straight. The news media swarms the case and calls it the hate crime trial of the century. Reporters describe Cartman as a monster and a racist. Some of that scorn comes from the strangest place, from the fact that he simply describes Token as black while talking in court, as if naming a plain fact out loud is now part of the crime. The room has already decided what Cartman is before anyone weighs what actually happened on that hill. He is found guilty of committing a hate crime. The punishment is where the episode lands its hardest hit. The judge does not hand down a detention or a fine or a warning. He sentences Cartman to a maximum security juvenile prison, a place the show calls the Alamosa Maximum Security Juvenile Hall, and he is to stay there until he turns 21. Cartman is 8. That sentence is 13 years. The judge says out loud that he wants to make an example of this boy, to send a message and scare off other racists. The point of locking the child up has drifted away from the rock and the black eye. It has become about what the punishment will say to everyone watching. Cartman bolts. He runs straight out of the courtroom and over to Kenny's house, and the two of them attempt a getaway in Kenny's battery-powered toy car, a little ride-on Bronco. They aim for the Mexican border and the freedom on the other side of it. The problem is that a toy car crawls along at a few miles an hour, so this great escape is one of the slowest chases ever put on screen. They somehow dodge the police and even crash through a roadblock, but the battery dies right at the edge of the border, and Cartman gets scooped up and shipped off to the juvenile prison. That slow, doomed run in a Bronco is a wink back to a real and famous slow-speed police chase that the whole country once watched live, and to the white Bronco the show had already used as a joke 2 seasons earlier. The same gag keeps circling back whenever the show talks about court. Inside the prison, Cartman has to survive among kids far tougher than he is. He gets close to a hardened young inmate named Romper Stomper, a boy who has clearly been locked up a long time and runs things on the inside. To earn the older kids' respect, Cartman sneaks forbidden items into the prison by hiding them in a place no guard wants to search. Once he has proven himself, he talks Romper Stomper into helping him break out. The whole stretch plays as like a grim adult prison movie, except every prisoner is a small child, which is the entire joke and also the entire point. The show keeps shrinking serious grown-up machinery down onto kids to show how strange and heavy it really is. Back in town, the boys want Cartman free, and their reasons are not noble at all. They need their heavy friend on the sled or the girls will win the race. So they put together a group they call the Free Eric Cartman Now Committee, with Stan, Kyle, and Token himself among them. The kid who got the black eye is now campaigning to spring the kid who threw the rock. They prepare a presentation and bring their case to the governor, and they give it a blunt title. They call it Hate Crime Laws, a Savage Hypocrisy. This presentation is the heart of the whole episode, the part where the show stops joking long enough to say what it actually thinks. The argument the boys make is simple. Cartman threw the rock because he is a fat, angry kid who lost his temper the exact same way he loses his temper 100 times a week. He did not throw it because Token is black. Treating the rock as a crime of racial hatred and punishing it far more harshly for that reason means the law is now handing out different punishments for the very same act based on the color of the person who got hit. The boys argue that this is unfair on its face and that a law which claims to fight unequal treatment is creating its own kind of unequal treatment. Their plea works. The governor agrees. The boys break Cartman out, get cornered by the police outside, and are then told that thanks to their passionate case to the governor, Cartman has already been let off and his punishment canceled. This is the show planting a flag, and it helps to know what was happening in the country at the time. Around the year 2000, America was in a loud, ongoing argument about hate crime laws, which add extra punishment when a crime is driven by hatred for someone's race, religion, or who they are. A couple of shocking, widely reported attacks in the late 1990s had pushed the whole country to talk about whether to pass stronger laws of this kind. Parker and Stone walked straight into that argument and took a side. Their position, said plainly through the boys, is that punishing the same act differently, depending on the victim, is a double standard, and that the law in these cases starts reaching past what a person did and into what a person was thinking, which makes them uneasy. This is a real and serious debate, and plenty of thoughtful people land on the other side of it and make strong arguments that these laws protect protect groups who get targeted again and again. The episode is not the final word on any of that. The episode is the show stating, in its loud and clumsy way, where its own gut sits. The reason the show could make that argument at all is the reason it picked Cartman in the first place. A viewer can love Token, can know that Cartman is a horrible, racist little boy who probably deserves 100 punishments for other things, and can still feel that 13 years in a prison for one thrown rock is insane. That uncomfortable gap is a whole machine. The show is forcing the audience to separate two feelings that usually travel together: the feeling that a person is bad and the feeling that a particular punishment is fair. By making the test case someone everybody despises, the episode makes sure nobody can wave the argument away by saying it only works because the kid was sweet and innocent. The kid is the opposite of sweet and innocent. The point still stands. For the young people watching, this lesson sank in the same sideways manner as the other. They were not memorizing the details of any law. They were picking up a habit of mind. They learned to stop and ask whether two people who do the same thing should really get different punishment. They learned to be a little suspicious of any system that seems to be measuring what is inside a person's head instead of what that person actually did. And they got an early taste of one of the strangest things a person can be asked to do, which is to stand up for the rights of someone they cannot stand, simply because the rule that protects that person protects everyone. Set this episode next to the two that came before it, and the show's running idea about the justice system snaps into clear focus. In the courtroom from the first case, the system rewarded the best performer over the truth. In the lawsuit storm of the second, a rule built to protect people got twisted into a tool for grabbing money. Here, a law built to fight hatred becomes, in the show's eyes, a machine for handing out uneven punishment and a stage for a judge who cares more about the message his sentence sends than about the boy in front of him. The thread running through all three is the same. The system keeps drifting away from the plain question of what a person actually did and toward the show around it, the performance, the headline, the example being made. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and the cost of losing keeps climbing. The first two cases were about money, about toys and payouts, and a broke school. This one was about freedom, about a child nearly buried in a prison until adulthood. The show was about to raise the stakes one more time and aim straight at something even harder to laugh off. In its next swing, it would put the full force of the government against a family, showing armed agents charging into a home to seize children and carry them out, and it would air that scene on television barely 2 days after the entire country had watched something almost exactly like it unfold for real. Section 4. When the government came to take the children to episodes after the rock-throwing trial, in that same spring of 2000, South Park pulled off something almost no other show on television could manage. It reached into the news, grabbed a story the whole country was still crying and shouting over, and put its own twisted version on the air only days later. Other shows took months to write and draw and finish an episode. This one was built so fast that critics could barely believe it had happened. To understand why people were stunned, the real story behind it comes first. A young boy named Elian Gonzalez had come from Cuba toward the United States on a small boat. The trip across the sea went badly. The boat sank, his mother died, and the little boy survived and was found in the water near Florida. His relatives in Miami took him in and wanted him to stay and grow up in America. His father, back in Cuba, wanted his son returned home to him. That single question, where one small child should live, split the entire country down the middle. For months, it was the biggest story in the news, argued about on every channel, with huge crowds and strong feelings on both sides. It ended in the spring of 2000 when the United States government sent armed agents into the Miami home before sunrise to take the boy by force and hand him back to his father. A photographer caught one image during that raid, a government agent in heavy gear pointing a gun toward the closet where the frightened boy was, hiding, and that picture spread everywhere. South Park aired its version only days after that raid. Parker and Stone already had half an episode written, a story about a strange circus coming to town, but they had no ending for it. When the real raid happened, they had their ending, and they raced it onto the screen while the country was still reeling. The result is the 4th episode of the 4th season, and it is one of the clearest examples of how fast and how fearless the show could be. The episode opens far away from any of that. The families of South Park go to see a fancy circus, a parody of the famous real circus full of acrobats and strange acts. The boys are bored by most of it, but they cannot look away from one act. 5 young sisters from Romania who can bend and twist their bodies into shapes that should not be possible. These are the quintuplets, 5 identical girls traveling with their grandmother. The boys, true to form, do not see 5 children. They see a money-making act, and they start dreaming about starting their own show. The sisters and their grandmother have a bigger problem than the boy. The Romanian government wants them back, and they are trying to get away from it. They end up on the doorstep of Stan's family, the Marshes, asking for a place to hide. The Marshes take them in. Then the grandmother dies, and the quiet family situation becomes a national tug-of-war because now the Romanian government is demanding the children be returned, and a crowd of American protesters is gathering outside the Marsh house, waving signs and insisting the girls be allowed to stay. Running alongside all this is Kenny, and his little story is the sharpest joke in the whole episode. Kenny turns out to have a beautiful singing voice, and he decides he wants real training, the kind they teach in Europe. He sings a famous opera song on the street to raise money, then travels all the way to Romania to study. And in Romania, the poor kid from the trailer park becomes a celebrated singer. His mother joins him and realizes that the small amount of money they have from America stretches incredibly far over there, enough to live like rich people. So they stay, while the whole country fights over how desperately these Romanian children must want to live in America. Kenny quietly goes the other direction and finds a better life in the place everyone assumes is worse. The show buries its point right there in the background, never stopping to explain it. The big finish lands exactly where the real news did. The Romanian government, unable to get the children back on its own, turns to the most powerful law official in the United States to do the job. That official was a real person named Janet Reno, the head of the entire country's law enforcement, the same office that ran the real raid in Florida. In the episode, Reno comes to take the children, and the show dresses her in a costume that turns the whole grim scene into something cartoonish and disturbing at the same time. She arrives in a full Easter Bunny suit, and she is carrying a gun. An armed Easter Bunny breaks into the home and seizes the 5 girls by force, a direct hit at that famous photograph of the agent with the gun and the hiding child. Sharon Marsh, furious that strangers have stormed her house and wrecked it, grabs a baseball bat and clubs Reno with it. In the chaos, the quintuplets' father, who has shown up acting like he missed them terribly, gets killed when one of the agent's guns goes off by accident. The most important moment comes from the children themselves. After being yanked back and forth by every adult and every government for the whole episode, the quintuplets finally stop and tell every single side off, one by one. They turn on their father, who walked out on them 5 years ago and is now pretending to be heartbroken. They turn on the Romanian leaders, who only want them back so they can make America look foolish. They turn on the American side for only caring about the money the girls could bring in. They turn on Janet Reno for doing the whole thing for attention. They even turn on the protesters outside, telling them to get a life and find something better to do. And they turn on the boys, calling out their ignorance about Romania, their lazy assumption that America must be better than anywhere else, and the fact that the boys only ever wanted them for the circus act. That speech is the show planting its flag again, the same way the rock-throwing episode used a presentation to a governor. The point is blunt. In a giant, tearful fight that everyone claims is about saving the children, not one single person actually cares about the children. Every side is using the kids as a tool. Two governments want them as a way to win points against each other. The media wants them as a story. The protesters want them as a cause to feel good about. The host family and the boys want them for what they can get out of them. Even the children's own father is faking his feelings for show. The show looks at the whole weeping, shouting circus, and says the quiet part out loud, that the children at the center of it are not people to these adults at all. They are a prize. What makes the ending land so hard is the very last beat. After being seized at gunpoint and fought over by the entire world, the quintuplets do not disappear into some sad fate. They go on a famous television talk show and start a tour of interview. They cash in. The children learn the exact lesson the adults around them have been teaching all episode, that attention and sympathy can be turned into money, and they grab their share. Everybody in the story ends up using somebody, including the kids who were used the worst. The way the joke about Janet Reno was built shows how carefully the show aimed it. The Easter Bunny costume is silly, almost childish. The gun in the bunny's hands is the opposite, cold and frightening. Putting those two things together in one image forces the strangeness of the real event into the open. A government had sent armed people in heavy gear to point weapons inside a home in order to take a small child, all in the name of doing the right thing, and the country had watched it happen. By dressing that up as a gun-toting Easter Bunny, the show made the real picture look as bizarre as it actually was once a person stopped and really looked at it. For the country watching in 2000, the episode hit a nerve that was still raw. People had spent months picking sides, certain that their side was the one that truly cared about the boy. South Park stepped into the middle of all that certainty and suggested that maybe none of the loud, weeping grown-ups were really thinking about the child at all, that the boy had become a flag each side was waving to win an argument. That idea was uncomfortable precisely because it rang true to so many people who had grown tired of the whole spectacle. For the kids watching, the lesson settled in sideways once more. They were not learning the details of any law about which country a child belongs in. They were picking up a way of seeing the world. They learned to be suspicious of the adults who shout the loudest about protecting children or saving saving the innocent, and to ask what those adults might be getting out of the noise. They picked up the idea that governments and news channels will happily use a real person as a prop, and tucked inside Kenny's quiet trip to Romania, they got a small sly poke at the easy belief that America is automatically the best place on earth for everyone, no matter what. Lined up against the cases before it, this episode shows the same pattern wearing a new outfit. In the first courtroom, the system rewarded the best performance over the plain truth. In the lawsuit storm, a good rule got twisted into a tool for grabbing money. In the rock-throwing trial, a law meant to fight hatred became a stage for a judge to make an example. Here, the raw power of the government and the noise of the media turn a fight over children into pure theater, where every side performs its concern while the actual people in the middle get treated as objects. The thread holding all four together is steady and clear. The system keeps presenting itself as a place where the right thing gets done, while it actually runs on performance attention and whatever each player stands to gain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The price of being caught in that system has climbed with every case. It started as money, toys and payouts, and a broke school. It rose to freedom, a child nearly locked away for years. Now it has reached armed agents and force used against a family in their own home. The show would keep pushing into new corners of the law. Its next target sat at the edge of something brand new in the early 2000s, the internet. It would show a world where the police and the richest, most famous people around joined hands to treat ordinary kids sitting at a home computer and clicking a single button as criminals worth chasing down and putting in handcuffs. Section 5. Handcuffs for a Song. By 2003, South Park had turned into a finely tuned machine for catching the world in the act. The show was 7 seasons deep, fast and sure, and very good at grabbing whatever the country was arguing about that month. That fall it aimed at a fight that was brand new, one that only existed because of the internet, and one that pitted some of the richest people on the planet against ordinary kids sitting in their bedroom. The fight came out of a simple chain. For most of history, getting a song meant buying it on a record or a tape or a shiny disc. Then the internet arrived, and a program called Napster let people share and download songs from each other for free with a few clicks. Suddenly, a kid with no money could fill a computer with thousands of songs without paying a cent. The music industry panicked. Record companies watched their old way of making money start to crack, and they decided to fight back hard. By the time this episode aired, the big music companies had begun taking ordinary people to court over downloading, not just sketchy criminals, but regular fans, students, teenagers, even children and grandparents. The drummer of the band Metallica, a man named Lars Ulrich, became the face of that anger after his band went after Napster, and a lot of fans started to see him as a rich man whining about money. That was the powder keg South Park dropped a match into. The episode begins with the boys forming a band of their own called Moop. They cannot agree on what kind of music to make, and the argument gets heated. Cartman, sure he knows best, makes a bet with Kyle that his music will sell 1 million copies before Kyle's ever does, and then he storms off to do his own thing. Cartman's own thing is one of the show's all-time great schemes. He decides to start a Christian rock band called Faith Plus One, and he pulls in Butters to play drums and Token to play bass. Cartman has no real religious feeling at all. He just sees Christian music as an easy market full of buyers. His method for writing holy songs is pure Cartman. He takes ordinary love songs, the kind full of words like baby and darling, and he swaps those words out for the word Jesus. That is the entire trick. With that one cheap move, he cranks out an album, gets signed by a big record company, and watches his fake worship music become a giant hit. The boy who believes in nothing becomes a Christian superstar overnight, purely because he spotted a way to make money. While Cartman climbs the charts, the rest of Moop, which is now Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, are stuck. They want a fresh sound, and they figure the way to find it is to listen to a lot of other music. The boys decide that buying it all on disc costs too much, so they download a pile of songs off the internet for free. They are 3 kids looking for inspiration, doing the exact thing millions of kids were doing at the time. And then their door bursts open and federal agents from the FBI storm in and arrest them for it. The show treats this as if the boys had committed a terrible crime. An FBI agent takes the arrested children in hand and decides to teach them a lesson about the damage their downloading has done. He walks them through a tour of the suffering they have supposedly caused, built to look like an old Christmas ghost story, the kind where a mean man is shown the pain around him until he repents. Except the suffering the agent reveals is the heart of the whole joke, and it is brilliant. The agent shows the boys the so-called victims of music downloading, and the victims are some of the wealthiest celebrities alive. The drummer Lars Ulrich is shown in real anguish because thanks to people downloading songs for free, he will have to wait a few extra months before he can install a gold-plated bar with a built-in Shark Tank next to his swimming pool. Britney Spears is shown crushed because she has to trade down from one enormous private jet to a slightly smaller private jet, one so inferior earlier that it lacks a remote control for the surround sound movie system. Another star's young son might not get his own tropical island for his birthday. The agent presents each of these as a heartbreaking tragedy, and he expects the boys to weep with guilt over it. That single gag carries the entire argument of the episode, and it is razor sharp. The music industry had spent years telling the public that downloading was theft, that it hurt the artist, that every free song was a wound. South Park looked at that message and asked a quiet, deadly question: who exactly is bleeding here? The answer the episode gives is that the people crying poor are unimaginably rich, and the harm they suffer is having to settle for a still absurd amount of luxury instead of slightly more. By showing the loss as a smaller private jet and a delayed Shark Tank, the show stripped the noble cause down to what it really looked like from below, which was the wealthy and powerful using the full weight of the law to protect their fortune. The boys, being children and easy to scare, swallow the guilt trip whole. They become so horrified by the harm they think downloading causes that their band goes on strike, refusing to play any music at all until people everywhere stop downloading for free. A crowd of real famous musicians joins their strike, lending their faces to the cause. In their most desperate stretch, Kyle tries to keep his bandmates going by telling them to push through the hard time. The irony is that while these kids stand around defending music with all their hearts, they are not actually making any. That irony lands fully at the end. Cartman's fake Christian band finishes the race first, and word comes that album has sold enough to win the music business's biggest prize, the platinum record. Cartman is thrilled to have won the bet. Then the rug gets pulled. Christian albums, it turns out, cannot go platinum at all. The highest honor a Christian album can earn is named after the gifts that were given to the baby Jesus, ending with a prize called Myrrh. Because of that one technicality, Cartman cannot get a platinum record no matter how many he sells, which means he loses the bet with Kyle. The bet was over $10. Cartman cares about that $10 more than about the fortune he just made, and he loses his temper so completely in front of all his devoted Christian fans that he destroys everything he built in a single ugly outburst. Kyle, for his part, is left realizing that he spent the whole story so busy guarding music that he forgot to ever create any. What makes this episode bite so hard is that it refused to take the side everyone expected it to take. The polite, approved opinion of the time was that downloading was simply stealing from hard-working artists. South Park agreed that downloading took something, then turned the camera around and looked at who was doing the taking back. The law had lined up behind the most powerful players in the business and aimed itself at ordinary people, including kids, who had done nothing more than click a button. The show framed the FBI not as protectors of justice, but as muscle hired to guard rich people's money, scaring children in the name of a Shark Tank bar. The country in 2003 felt the truth in that. Regular families really were getting letters and lawsuits from the music industry, demanding huge sums for songs their teenagers had downloaded. To a lot of people, it felt backward, like watching the most powerful companies in the world declare war on their own customers, many of them young. South Park caught that exact feeling and made it impossible to look away from by putting the suffering of the so-called victims right on screen and revealing it as a slightly less fancy jet. For the young people watching, this one taught a lesson that cut deeper than the others. They learned to ask a single sharp question about any law or any crackdown. Who is this actually protecting? They watched a system rush to defend people who already had everything while treating people who had almost nothing as criminals, and they came away with a lasting suspicion that rules are sometimes written and enforced to guard the rich rather than to deliver fairness. For a whole generation that grew up downloading music and feeling like outlaws for it, the episode put their own quiet annoyance into words and held it up to the light. Stack this against the cases before it, and an old thread tightened. The show's very first swing at the courts, years earlier, was also about a song. Back then, a record company used a clever lawyer to crush a single artist who only wanted credit for what he wrote, and the system rewarded the company. Now the entire music industry uses the police to crush its own fans over songs, and the system rewards the industry again. The same pattern keeps surfacing in different clothes, whether the little person is an artist begging for his name on a record or a kid clicking download in his bedroom. The machine tilts toward whoever holds the money and the power. Justice is not the thing being served. Protection of the strong is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cost of crossing that machine has shifted again. The early cases were about money, then about freedom, then about force used on a family. This one is about something quieter and more modern, the way the law can reach into an ordinary home through a computer and turn an everyday act into a crime, all to keep the powerful comfortable. The show would follow that idea forward into the years ahead, into a world where the trap had quietly flipped on its head. The danger would no longer be taking something without paying for it. The danger would be agreeing to something without reading it, where a single tap on a glowing screen, the kind of button nobody ever actually stops to read before pressing, could bind a person to a deal so monstrous that no court on Earth would step in to save them from it. Section 6. The Button Nobody Reads. By 2011, South Park had been on the air for well over a decade, and the world around it had changed in a way that handed the show a perfect new target. Phones had turned into tiny computers. Tablets had arrived, and a sleek one made by Apple, the iPad, had become the must-have object everyone wanted to be seen holding. And with all those new gadgets came a small, strange ritual that almost every person on Earth now performed without thinking. Before using a new program, or updating an old one, a long wall of legal rules would appear on the screen, and at the bottom sat a single button that said agree. Nearly nobody read the rule. Everybody pressed the button. The 15th season opened by asking what would happen if pressing that button actually meant something. The episode splits between two stories, and the important one belongs to Kyle. Like almost everyone, Kyle had recently updated the music program on his computer, and a fresh set of rules had popped up for him to accept. He did what every normal person does. He scrolled past the wall of text he had no intention of reading and tapped agree. The twist is that Kyle turns out to be one of only a tiny handful of people in the entire world who never actually read those rules, and the company has been waiting for someone exactly like him. Apple comes for Kyle. Their agents track him down, and when his father tries to step in, they knock the man out with a stun gun and haul Kyle away. They throw him into a cage with two other people, a man and a woman, who share his one fatal mistake. All three had agreed to rules they never read, and the rules, it turns out, gave the company permission to do something monstrous to whoever signed without looking. The detail about Kyle's father is the first quiet gut punch. Gerald, Kyle's dad, is a lawyer. He spends his whole working life around contracts and rules and the law. When his own son is dragged off because of a clicked button, all of his training and all of his lawyering count for nothing. The company tasers him and steps over his body. The episode is making a point with that image. The trap here is built so deep into everyday life that even a man who knows the law cannot pull his own child out of it. Then comes the reveal, and it is one of the most stomach-turning ideas the show ever put on screen. The head of Apple, Steve Jobs, unveils his secret new product to a room of excited employees. The product is the 3 captured people. Jobs has had them surgically joined together into a single living machine, one body made of 3, with an iPhone fixed to the front and an iPad attached to the back. The whole horrible thing is built as a parody of a notorious horror movie about a mad scientist who sews people together, and the show leans into how revolting it is on purpose. Jobs proudly calls his creation the human centipad, and he plans to teach it to read and to walk. Underneath the gross out shock, the joke is razor clean. Kyle is being turned into a piece of furniture, and the only reason it is allowed is that he agreed to it. He pressed a button. He said yes to a set of rules he never bothered to read, and those rules happen to give the company the right to do this. The episode keeps hammering the running joke that drives the entire thing. Even after all of this, even after seeing what his signature led to, Kyle still keeps signing new papers that get shoved in front of him without ever stopping to read them. Jobs, frustrated, tests him again and again, and Kyle fails every time because the habit is too strong. The show is laughing at something true about everyone, that people will keep clicking agree forever, no matter how badly it burns them. Trying to save Kyle, his father and the boys go to the Apple store and beg the company's own tech support workers for help, the ones Apple calls its geniuses. After a bizarre ritual, the geniuses find a way out, and the way out says as much as anything in the episode. The only escape from Kyle's agreement is for his father, who had never owned an Apple product in his life, to sign up and join Apple himself. By entering into a brand new arrangement with the company, Gerald can cancel the old one. So Kyle does not get freed by a judge, a court, or any kind of justice. He gets freed by his dad signing yet another agreement. The way out of one set of unread rules is to accept another set of unread rules. The trap does not open onto freedom. It opens onto more fine print. The second story in the episode runs alongside this and stars Cartman, who is the only kid in his grade without an iPad and is losing his mind over it. When his mother refuses to buy him the expensive tablet, Cartman does the most Cartman thing imaginable. He spreads a shocking and completely false story about his mother mistreating him, twisting a terrible kind of accusation into a tool to win everyone's pity and pressure them into helping him get the gadget he wants. His scheme even lands him on a famous television talk show. The plan works for a while because people believe the awful lie, which is exactly the kind of dark joke the show loved. A boy weaponizing sympathy to score a toy. In the end, Cartman gets struck down for it, ending the episode beaten up in a hospital bed and crying, while his mother sits beside him flipping through a magazine, completely unbothered. The two stories rhyme with each other in a way that fits the larger idea. Both are about people working a system. Cartman games the kindness of strangers by lying about being a victim, the same trick he has pulled in earlier episodes when he sued a classmate, or played the wrong party in a hate crime trial. The company gains the trust of millions by hiding a monstrous rule inside a wall of text it knows nobody will read. In both cases, the trick succeeds because of a simple human truth that people do not stop to check the fine print, whether it is a sad story or a long legal page. The real world the episode was poking at is one everyone lives in. Every app, every program, every update demands that a person accept a long set of rules first, and study after study has shown that almost nobody reads them. Companies have even tested this by sneaking strange clauses into their rules. Things like claiming a person's soul, just to prove no one would notice, and sure enough, no one did. The catch is that these agreements are usually real and binding. By tapping agree, a person can genuinely sign away rights and accept terms they never saw. Most of the time, the terms are boring. The point South Park grabbed onto is that the everyday person has no real power in the deal. The choice is to accept whatever the company wrote in full without reading it, or to not use the thing at all. There is no middle ground, no chance to argue, no one to negotiate with. The big company writes the rules, and the individual either bows or walks away. That is the justice system angle hiding inside a gross horror cartoon. A contract is supposed to be a fair deal between two sides who both understand it and both agree to it. The whole idea rests on the belief that when a person says yes, that yes actually means something, that they knew what they were agreeing to. The episode rips that idea wide open. Kyle said yes in the eyes of the rules, but he had no clue what he was saying yes to, and the law treats his blind click as a real and binding promise anyway. The gap between agreeing and actually understanding has grown into a canyon, and the powerful side of the deal lives in that gap. The fiction that everyone reads and understands what they sign keeps the whole machine running, and the company counts on that fiction every single day. For the young people watching, this lesson cut close to their daily life. They were the first generation to grow up, tapping agree dozens of times a week, handing over pieces of themselves to companies they would never meet, accepting rules they would never read. The episode named that quiet unease for them. They learned to feel the weight of the button they kept pressing without thought, and to suspect the size of the gap between what they were told they were agreeing to and what they were actually signing over. They picked up a wariness about the moment a powerful company says you agreed to this, when the truth is closer to you, click the button you were never meant to read. Set beside the cases before it, this episode shows the same machine from a fresh angle, and an old face returns to prove it. Gerald the lawyer has now appeared 3 times in this story. In the very first courtroom, he was the honest lawyer who told the plain truth and lost to a slick trick. A season later, he became the trickster himself, growing rich off twisted lawsuits. Now, years on, he is just a frightened father whose legal knowledge means nothing, because the trap his son fell into was not built by a clever opponent in a courtroom. It was built into the everyday system itself, into a button and a wall of text and a company too big to argue with. The thread holding all of these together has not changed. The system keeps claiming to rest on fairness and on honest agreement, while it actually serves whoever holds the power, and it counts on ordinary people never reading closely enough to notice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The danger has shifted one more time. The earlier cases punished people for what they took, whether toys or downloaded songs, or simply for losing their temper. This one punishes a person for what he agreed to without understanding, a trap sprung by saying yes instead of by doing wrong. The show would carry that idea forward inside this same season and aim it at something even bigger than one trapped boy. Instead of a single person caught by something he signed, it would show a whole crowd of people doing all the hard work and walking away with nothing, while everyone standing above them grew rich off that work, and all of it kept neatly, carefully, perfectly legal. And years later, in a real courtroom at the very top of the country, real judges would look at the real version of that exact setup and decide the cartoon had been telling the truth the whole time. Section 7. The players who never got paid in 2011. Deep into its 15th season, South Park went after a money machine that millions of people loved and almost nobody questioned: college sports. Across America, college football and basketball games filled giant stadiums, drew huge television audiences, and pulled in billions of dollars. Schools earned fortune, coaches were paid millions, television networks paid enormous sums for the right to show the games, and video game companies sold games built around the players. Money flowed to everyone in the system, with one strange and glaring exception: the players themselves. The young men actually running, sweating, and getting hurt on the field were not allowed to be paid a single dollar. The rules said they had to stay unpaid. They were called student athletes, handed free college as their reward, and told that this was fair. South Park looked at that setup and decided to drag the ugliness of it into the open in the most shocking way it could find. The organization that ran all of this was a real group called the NCAA, the body in charge of college sports in the United States. The NCAA made the rules, and its biggest, most defended rule was that the athletes could not be paid. Anyone who took money could be thrown out. So a player could star in a game watched by tens of millions, a game that earned his school and the networks a fortune, and walk away with nothing in his his pocket while everyone above him got rich. By 2011, this was starting to bother a lot of people, and a quiet argument was building about whether the whole thing was a polite kind of robbery. South Park did not do quiet. The episode begins with Kyle, the show's usual voice of conscience. He sees a sad television commercial, the kind designed to make people cry and reach for their wallets, about babies born already sick and suffering because their mothers used a dangerous drug while pregnant. Moved by it, Kyle goes to volunteer at the hospital to help these babies. And when he gets there, he discovers that Cartman has gotten there first with a business. Cartman, along with Clyde and Craig, has come up with something monstrous. He films the sick baby scrambling after a lump of the drug, turns the footage into a kind of show, and sells it for money. He calls his operation the Crack Baby Athletic Association. It is one of the most uncomfortable ideas the show ever put on screen, and that discomfort is the entire point, because the babies are standing in for something real. The babies are the college athletes. They do all the work, or in this case suffer all the harm, and Cartman and his partners pocket every cent. Kyle's reaction is the most revealing part of the whole episode. He is horrified at first, exactly the way the audience is meant to be. Then Cartman invites him to come in as the business's money man, the one who handles the cash and keeps the books. And Kyle, the moral center of the show, the kid who is supposed to know right from wrong, says yes. Once the money starts coming in, he changes. He starts dressing and talking like a slick, greedy businessman, the kind of character who treats everything as a deal. He keeps turning to Stan, who is disgusted by the whole thing and insisting that it is all completely legal, that nothing wrong is happening, that the babies are not being used because they are not even being paid. So how could anyone say they are being mistreated? That twisted logic, the idea that paying someone nothing somehow proves they are not being taken advantage of, is the exact argument the NCA used in real life, repeated almost word for word by a cartoon kid in a suit. The show makes its biggest, most dangerous swing when Cartman goes looking for advice from the experts. To learn how the system manages to make so much money off people it never pays, he travels to a real Colorado university and asks to meet the man in charge. And he shows up dressed as a plantation owner from the days of slavery, speaking in a thick southern drawl, openly calling the school's athletes slaves and asking the man how he runs his slave operation so smoothly. The dean throws him out. The comparison is deliberate and harsh on purpose. The show is forcing a connection that made a lot of viewers squirm between a system where mostly young black men generate billions of dollars in unpaid labor and an older, far darker American system of unpaid labor. It is an extreme and provocative thing to say, and South Park said it flatly, daring the audience to explain what the real difference was. The money side of the story brings in another real player. The group strikes a deal with a video game company, a real company that in the real world made wildly popular college sports games built around actual college players, using their faces, their numbers, and their bodies while paying those players nothing. In the episode, the video game company does exactly what it did in life. It uses the work, takes the profit, and then cuts the boys out entirely, refusing to hand over a dime. Kyle had planned to spend the money on a fancy home for the crack babies, a way to make the whole thing feel less awful. But once the company screws them over, even that small comfort collapses. The people at the very top simply take everything and leave the ones below with nothing. The way the episode is built makes its point land hard because it never lets the audience off the hook. The central image is awful by design. Watching sick babies chase a lump of a drug for someone else's profit is meant to turn the stomach, and the show knows that the moment a viewer recoils and thinks that this is monstrous, this is clearly wrong. It has set the trap, because the babies are the athletes, and if the cartoon version is obviously sickeningly wrong, then the real version, the one millions of people happily cheer for every weekend, has to be looked at again. Kyle's calm insistence that it is all legal and fair is the same thing the audience had been hearing from the real system for years, and hearing it come out of a greedy cartoon kid makes it sound as hollow as it always was. The country in 2011 was right on the edge of this argument. More and more people were noticing the strangeness of a billion-dollar business where the workers were forbidden from being paid. Coaches were signing contracts worth tens of millions. Schools were building palaces. Television deals kept growing. And the players, many from families with almost nothing, were told that a scholarship was payment enough and that asking for more would get them banned. The word student athlete was doing a lot of heavy lifting, dressing up the arrangement to make it sound noble and fair. South Park grabbed that word and that arrangement and showed what they looked like with the polish scraped off. The young people watching, this episode taught one of the sharpest lessons in the whole run. They learned to listen closely to the words people use to defend a system, because those words are often where the trick lives. Student athlete sounds warm and fair. Amateur sounds pure and noble. It is all completely legal sounds like an answer. The episode pulled those phrases apart and showed the plain machine underneath, a machine that took the effort of the powerless and handed the rewards to the powerful. The deeper lesson, the The one that stuck is that something can be perfectly legal and deeply unfair at the very same time, and that the people running an unfair system will always have a calm, reasonable sounding reason for why it is fine. What makes this case stand apart from every other one in this story is what happened next, in the real world, in a real courtroom. For most of these episodes, the show was making a point, taking a side, throwing a punch. Here, the show made a prediction without quite meaning to, and the highest court in the country proved it right. About 10 years after this episode aired, the argument the cartoon had made finally reached the Supreme Court of the United States, the most powerful court in the land, case known as NCI versus Alston. The court looked at the NCI, at its rules that kept athletes from being paid, at the billions the system earned, and it ruled against the NC. The decision was unanimous, meaning every single one of the 9 judges agreed. One of them wrote separately to say, in plain and blistering terms, that the NCA was not above the law, and that a business making this much money, while refusing to pay the people who earned it, would never be allowed in almost any other part of American life. Around the same time, the rules were finally torn down, and college athletes won the right to earn money from the use of their own names, their own faces, their own fame for the first time. Sit with what that means for a moment. A crude cartoon, one that made its argument by filming drug-addicted babies and dressing a 4th grader as a plantation owner, said that the college sports system was a polite robbery dressed up in nice words. A decade later, the most serious and powerful judges in the entire country looked at the real version and, in their own careful language, said the same thing. The show had not simply mocked the system. The show had been right, and it had been right years before the law caught up. That changes something about the running idea of this whole story. Across every case so far, the show has kept insisting that the justice system and the rules around it tilt toward the powerful, that the machine serves money and dresses the service up as fairness. In the courtroom from the very first case, the better performer beat the truth. In the lawsuit storm, a good rule became a money grab. In the music downloading raid, the law became muscle for the rich. With the clicked agreement, a giant company trapped an ordinary person using rules nobody reads. Each of those was the show being sharp and suspicious. This one is different because the suspicion got tested against reality and held up. When South Park said the rules had been built to let the strong take from the weak while staying perfectly legal, this was the time a real court eventually agreed out loud. The cartoon's cynicism turned out to be plain accuracy. The thread tying everything together has not moved. The system keeps claiming to run on fairness while it actually runs on power and money, and it keeps protecting that arrangement with calm, official-sounding words. Crack Baby Athletic Association simply found the version of that truth that the country could no longer deny, the version that ended up being settled in the highest court there is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The harm in these cases keeps changing shape. Early on, the cost was money, then freedom, then force used on a family, then a single person trapped by something he signed. Here it is, the slow, legal draining of work and effort from people who never get a share. The show would soon turn to a kind of taking that is quieter and more invisible than any of these, one where the thing being taken is not a person's money or labor or freedom, but their privacy. In its next strike, it would step right into the middle of the biggest spying scandal of modern times, the moment the entire country woke up to the news that its own government had been secretly watching everyone, listening to calls and reading messages, with nobody's permission and nobody's knowledge. And the show would hand the job of exposing that secret to the single last person on Earth anyone would ever trust to tell the truth. Section 8, The Eye That Watched Everyone. In the summer of 2013, the United States learned a secret about itself, and the secret was enormous. A man who had worked for the government's most secretive spy agency walked away with a mountain of hidden documents and handed them to reporters. That agency is known by 3 letters, the NSA, which stands for the National Security Agency, and its job is to listen, to watch, and to gather information using computers and phone lines. What the documents showed shook the whole country. The agency had been quietly collecting records on millions of ordinary Americans, people who had done nothing wrong and were suspected of nothing at all, records of phone calls, of who rang whom and when, pieces of what people typed and sent across the internet, all of it scooped up in secret, with nobody told and nobody asked. The man who revealed it, named Edward Snowden, became one of the most argued about people on Earth. Some called him a hero for telling the truth. Others called him a traitor for spilling the nation's secret. He fled the country, and he never came back. That story landed on America like a thunderclap, and the argument it started went straight to the heart of how a free country is supposed to work. People had always believed there was a line, a wall around their private lives that the government could not cross without a very good reason, and without permission from a judge. The document suggested that wall had quietly come down years ago, and that nearly everyone had been watched in some small way the whole time. The country split into camps. Some people were furious, feeling robbed of something they could could not see or touch, but knew they had lost. Others shrugged and said that if it kept the country safe from attacks, the watching was a price worth paying, and that anyone with nothing to hide had nothing to fear. South Park dropped its 17th season premiere right into the middle of that storm, only a few months after the secret broke, and it did the thing the show loves most. It took the biggest, most serious topic in the news and handed it to its worst, smallest, most ridiculous character. The episode starts with something tiny and familiar, the kind of small annoyance everyone has lived through. Cartman has a habit of holding loud phone conversations in public on speakerphone, blasting his private business into every room he walks into. Kyle finally gets fed up and tells him to knock it off, to stop forcing everyone to hear his calls. And Cartman, in a leap of logic only Cartman could make, decides that Kyle complaining about hearing his calls means Kyle is invading his privacy. From there, his mind spirals. He becomes convinced that Kyle is secretly an agent of the NSA, sent to track him and listen to him. The boy who shouts his every thought to a crowded room has somehow decided that he is the one being spied on. Once that idea takes root, Cartman launches a full crusade against the government's watching. He organizes a rally against the NSA, declaring that the government has no right to keep records of people's private lives. He casts himself as a brave truth teller, a fighter for freedom, a cartoon version of the real man who had just leaked the real secrets. And then comes one of the sharpest jokes in the episode. To spread thoughts to the world, Cartman signs up for a brand new kind of social media, a service that instantly broadcasts whatever a person is thinking straight out to everyone. It turns out the only other person in the world using this service is the actor Alec Baldwin, a man famous in real life for blasting his unfiltered opinions across the internet. So the great privacy crusader, the boy raging against being watched, voluntarily hooks himself up to a machine whose entire purpose is to expose his every private thought to the public. He is begging to be heard while screaming that he hates being listened to. The crusade reaches its peak when Cartman manages to sneak his way inside the NSA itself, determined to dig up its darkest secrets and reveal them to the world. The episode saves its biggest laugh for what he actually finds in there, but the part that matters most is what happens when Cartman looks up his own file. He has spent the whole episode certain that the all-seeing government has been obsessing over him, tracking his every move, hanging on his every word. What he discovers is that the agency has barely noticed him at all. His file is thin. He has not made waves. To the giant watching machine, Cartman is nobody worth watching. And this crushes him, because underneath all his shouting about privacy, what Cartman truly wanted was to matter. He wanted to be important enough to spy on. The dream he was chasing the whole time was not freedom from being watched. It was the feeling of being watched by someone powerful, because that would mean he was significant. That twist is the cleverest thing in the episode, and it cuts in a direction most stories about spying never go. The easy expected version of this tale is a brave hero exposing an evil watcher. South Park built something stranger and more honest about people. It showed a character who claims to be terrified of surveillance while doing everything in his power to be seen, who broadcasts his thoughts on purpose, who marches and rallies for attention, and who falls apart not when he learns he is being watched, but when he learns he is not. The show planted a quiet, uncomfortable idea in the middle of the national panic. A lot of the same people who feared being watched also secretly wanted it, because being watched can feel like being known, and being known can feel like being important. The loudest voice against the eye in the sky turned out to be the one most desperate for the eye to look its way. Running alongside Cartman's story is Butters, and his half takes the same fear and bends it into something even more pointed. Butters is the sweetest and most trusting kid in town, the one who believes the best about everyone. When he hears that the government is watching and knows everything about everyone, he does not feel afraid or angry. He feels comforted. To Butters, a power that sees all and knows all sounds less like a threat and more like a loving parent, or something even bigger. He decides that the government must want what is best for everyone, and that if it has been watching him, the right thing to do is to come clean about everything he has done wrong, so the all-knowing watcher will think well of him. So Butters goes to confess his sins, and the place he chooses to confess them is the most ordinary, most despised government building there is, the Department of Motor Vehicles. This is the dull office, known everywhere for its endless lines and bored clerks, where people go to get a license to drive. Butters walks up to a clerk and starts pouring out his private wrongdoings, treating the counter like a church and the clerk like a holy listener. He begins praying to the government to keep his friends safe. The strangest part is that it catches on. Other people start showing up to confess at the motor vehicles office too, until the place becomes a kind of temple, a house of worship built around the all-seeing government. For a while it works, until the power Butters has stumbled into gets twisted and abused, the way power in these episodes always does. The Butters story is the show making its boldest point, and it is a heavy one hiding inside a silly picture of people praying at a license office. The idea is this: a power that sees everything, knows everything, everything and watches everyone is exactly the kind of power people have always given to a god. It is all-seeing, it is everywhere, it judges, it cannot be hidden from. So when a government starts behaving that way, watching all, knowing all, some people will not fight it. They will do the thing humans have done with all-seeing powers for thousands of years. They will start to worship it. They will confess to it, pray to it, and trust it to take care of them, simply because it sees them. Butters is not afraid of the watching government because Butters turns it into a god, and a watching god is a comforting thing to a frightened person. The show is warning that the real danger of being watched is not only the watching itself, it is how easily people will bow to whatever watches them. For the country in 2013, the episode hit a raw and freshly opened nerve. The whole nation was arguing about the exact two reactions the show put on screen. There were the Cartmans, loud and outraged, and demanding their privacy back, some of them more in love with the drama of the fight than with the cause. And there were the Butterses, calm and trusting, ready to hand over their private lives to a government they assumed had their best interests at heart, sure that good people had nothing to hide. South Park looked at both camps and refused to fully flatter either one. It poked the angry crusaders for craving attention even as they shouted about privacy, and it poked the trusting believers for being so eager to kneel before any power big enough to watch them. The show found something foolish and human in both responses to losing something as precious as a private life. For the young people watching, this episode taught a lesson that grew more important every year of their lives. They were the first generation to grow up carrying a device in their pocket that could track where they went, what they said, what they bought, and what they searched for. They were going to live their entire lives being watched in ways no one before them ever had been, by governments and by companies alike. The episode handed them two warnings wrapped in jokes. The first was to be suspicious of the watcher, to remember that a private life is a real thing worth protecting even when no crime is involved. The second, the deeper one, was to watch their own hearts, to notice the strange human pull toward wanting to be seen, the temptation to trade away privacy for the feeling of mattering, and the even older temptation to worship whatever power looms large enough over a life. Set beside every case before it, this episode shifts the show's running idea onto new ground. The earlier stories were about systems that took things from people, their money, their freedom, their work. Here the thing being taken is more invisible than any of those. It is the simple privacy of a life, taken in silence, with no agreement and no warning, by the very government that claims to protect its people. And once again, the show insists that the system does not work the way it pretends to. A free country promised its people a wall around their private life, then quietly removed the wall and kept the promise hanging on the sign out front. The thread holding all of these cases together stretches all the way to here. The system keeps presenting itself as the guardian of ordinary people while quietly serving its own power, whether that power is money, control, or knowing everything there is to know. What makes this case sting in its own special way is that the watcher was not a record company or a greedy school or a tech giant. It was the government itself, the one body that is supposed to be on the people's side. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next time the show stepped up to the justice system, it would leave behind the quiet, invisible kind of harm and turn to the loudest, most painful question a court can ever face. Only 2 episodes later in that same season, South Park would walk straight into a real trial that had just split the entire country down the middle. A case where a young man was killed, the man who killed him walked out of the courtroom free, and a single law seemed to decide whose life could be taken without anyone ever paying for. It's Section 9, the trial that split the country. In the summer of 2013, the United States lived through one of the most painful arguments in its modern history, and it grew out of the death of a single teenager. The year before, in a town in Florida, a 17-year-old named Trayvon Martin was walking back from a store, carrying snacks, doing nothing wrong. He was black, and he was not armed. A man named George Zimmerman, a volunteer who watched the neighborhood for trouble, decided the teenager looked suspicious. He followed him. The two ended up in a struggle, and during that struggle, Zimmerman shot and killed the boy. Zimmerman said he had acted in self-defense, that he feared for his life. At first, he was not even arrested, which set off waves of anger across the country. After months of protest, he was finally put on trial for killing Trayvon Martin, and in July of 2013, a jury found him not guilty and set him free. That decision broke something open in America. To many people, and especially in black communities, the message of the verdict felt unbearable, like the law had announced that an unarmed black child could be killed and that no one would ever have to answer for it. Huge crowds filled the streets in city after city. Other people looked at the very same trial and saw a jury that had carefully followed the evidence and the law as it was actually written, and they believed the not guilty decision was the correct one, even though the death itself was a terrible tragedy. The country simply could not agree on what had happened or on what any of it meant, and the wound stayed raw and bleeding for a very long long time. The size of the reaction is hard to put into words. In the days and weeks after the verdict, marches and protests spread through dozens of cities, and the case became one of those rare moments that a whole generation remembers exactly where it was when the news came down. A short phrase that had started spreading online, 3 words about Black Lives Mattering, grew into a national movement in the years that followed, fueled in large part by the anger and heartbreak this verdict left behind. Newspapers, churches, schools, and families all found themselves arguing about the same hard question. Why had the man not been arrested for so long? What did the law actually allow? Whether a young black person could walk down a street without being treated as a threat. The conversation reached every corner of American life, and it did not fade quickly. It was still loud and still raw when South Park's writers sat down to build their episode, which is part of why putting any version of this on television at all was such a daring and risky thing to do. Right into the middle of that bleeding wound, only a few months after the verdict came down, the show aired one of the boldest and most uncomfortable episodes it ever made in its entire run. The show did not approach the subject gently, and it did not come at it from the obvious direction. Instead of telling the story in a straight line, it crawled inside the head of the most racist, most paranoid, and most frightened person in the whole town, Cartman, and it let his ugliest fears play out as if they were a monster movie. The episode borrows the shape of a popular film from that same year about a worldwide zombie outbreak, the kind of movie where a sickness spreads from person to person until the entire planet falls apart. Cartman keeps having nightmares in which he is the hero of that movie, racing against the clock to save his family from the end of the world. In Cartman's dream, the disaster that ends the world is not a normal sickness at all. The dream begins with a radio bulletin announcing that George Zimmerman has been found not guilty. The very instant the verdict is read aloud, every black person in the dream is suddenly overcome with rage and begins attacking everyone in sight, spreading like an outbreak, climbing over walls and swarming through the streets exactly the way the zombies do in the film. Cartman jolts awake in a cold sweat, certain that this nightmare is a warning of what is about to come in real life. His sleeping mind has taken the oldest and ugliest fear in the country, the senseless fear of black anger, and has turned it into a literal end-of-the-world disaster. What makes this work as comedy with a point, and what keeps it from being simply cruel, is that the show is plainly laughing at Cartman the entire time, never once agreeing with him. By blowing his fear up into a ridiculous zombie movie, the episode exposes how insane and how baseless that fear truly is. Cartman is the JoJo. His terror is the joke. The show is holding up the kind of fear that some frightened, prejudiced people carry around inside them, the rotten belief that an entire group of people is a ticking danger waiting to explode. And it is showing exactly how absurd and how cartoonish that belief looks the moment it gets dragged out into the daylight. Cartman is the worst person imaginable, and the show chose him on purpose because nobody in the audience wants to share his head, and that very discomfort is the whole point of the exercise. The choice to wrap the whole thing in a zombie movie is smarter than it first appeared. A zombie outbreak is a story about a crowd of people who have lost their minds and turned into a single mindless, unstoppable threat that must be fought and destroyed. By forcing the real verdict into that exact frame, the show was putting Cartman's fear on screen exactly as it looks from the inside of his head. To a person poisoned by that kind of fear, an entire group of human beings really does start to look like an approaching horde, a faceless danger rather than a crowd of separate people with their own lives and their own grief. The episode shows that twisted way of seeing so the audience can watch how ugly and how foolish it is. The zombie frame is the mirror the show holds up to racist fear, and the reflection it shows is a man so scared of other people that he has stopped seeing them as people at all. Convinced that his nightmare is a real warning from the future, Cartman fixes his attention on Token, the only black kid in all of South Park, and decides that Token must be the source of the coming disaster, the very first spark that will set the end of the world in motion. At first, he tries to befriend Token and keep him calm, hoping to stop the outbreak before it can ever begin. When that plan falls apart, Cartman decides that Token simply has to be removed. He marches down to the town gun shop to buy himself a weapon, and there he receives a lesson in the law. The shopkeeper explains the stand your ground law, which is a real kind of law in Florida and in a number of other states. That law says that a person who honestly feels their life is in danger is allowed to use force, even deadly force, to protect themselves without first having to try to walk away or escape. The entire real case had turned on a version of this very idea on the question of whether the killing counted as defending oneself. Once Cartman decides Token cannot be killed under Colorado rules, his twisted logic carries him somewhere even more extreme. He reasons that the true source of the coming disaster is not Token at all, but George Zimmerman himself, the first spark, and that the only way to stop the end of the world is to travel to Florida and take Zimmerman out before the outbreak can begin. So Cartman sets off across the country, and his trip becomes a string of small horrors played as dark comedy. Every time he spots a black passenger on his plane, his panic boils over, and that panic causes the plane to crash. He leaves a trail of wreckage and hundreds of deaths behind him, all because of the fear rattling around inside his head, and the show never lets him notice or care about the damage he is doing. A grown woman who helps him along the way is killed when she stops to thank him, and a truck slams into her. By the time Cartman reaches the Zimmerman house, the morning there is unfolding beat for beat like the morning from his nightmare. The line between his paranoid dream and the real world finally collapsing in on itself. Back home, Cartman cooks up a plan that becomes the sharpest moment in the whole episode. He figures out that he can get rid of Token and stay completely within the law if he can only claim that he was defending himself. So he carefully tricks Token into stepping closer to him, setting up a situation where he can later insist that he felt threatened, and then he shoots him. Token survives the shooting and ends up with a bandage, and both boys get hauled into Mr. Mackey's office at the school. And here the show brings its hammer down hard. When Mackey tries to settle the dispute between them by ordering the two boys to apologize to each other, Cartman is treated as the innocent one, excused entirely on the grounds that he had simply been standing his ground and protecting himself. He shot a classmate, and he walks away from it without any punishment at all. The show pushes the double standard even further before it is finished, twisting the outcome into the mirror image of the real one. In the episode's logic, once the danger gets pointed at a white man instead, the law suddenly stops dragging its feet and moves with stunning speed. A judge declares Zimmerman guilty on the spot with no jury and no slow trial, and the punishment is carried out almost instantly. It is the exact reverse of how the real case had gone, and the show stages it that way on purpose as a dark joke to make the unevenness impossible to miss. One direction brings endless delay, the benefit of every doubt, and a walk to freedom. The other brings a snap judgment and a swift, harsh end. By slamming those two opposite outcomes side by side, the episode argues that the speed and the mercy of the system seem to shift depending on who is standing where. Token's response is the beating heart of the entire episode, the line the whole story had been carefully built to arrive at. Furious and bandaged, he points out the exact thing the show wants its audience to sit with and feel. The protection of the law, the right to stand your ground and be forgiven for using force, never seems to stretch far enough to cover someone like him. The same rule that lets a frightened person walk free after shooting somebody else would somehow never once work in his favor, never protect a black kid the way it had just finished protecting a white one. In a small handful of angry words, Token names the show's entire argument out loud, the bitter idea that the law hands out its mercy and its protection unevenly, depending on the color of the person who is asking for it. That argument lands as hard as it does because it mirrors the exact thing the real country had just spent months screaming about from every direction. All across America, the painful question sitting on millions of minds was whether the justice system measured all lives by the same standard, or whether some people could be killed and have it quietly counted as self-defense while others never could. South Park took that enormous, heated, deadly serious question and forced it into the open through a strange story about a paranoid little boy and a zombie nightmare. The show made fun of the irrational fear that feeds racism, painting Cartman as a complete fool for carrying it, and at the very same time, it pointed a hard and steady finger at the law itself, at the way a rule that was supposed to protect everyone equally seemed in practice to protect some people far more reliably than it protected others. This is a place where honesty demands real care, because the actual case and the laws standing behind it remain things that thoughtful people argue about in good faith to this very day. Many are certain that the not guilty decision proved the system is broken at its core, that it valued one life less than another, and let a killing go unanswered. Others are just as certain that the jury did its difficult job under the law exactly as it was written, weighing only the evidence placed before it, and reached the single verdict that the evidence allowed, however heartbreaking the underlying death plainly was. The long debate over stand your ground laws runs along those same lines, with some people sure that the laws invite needless killing and then let it slide, and others sure that they protect an ordinary person's most basic right to defend their own life against a real attacker. South Park did not settle any of that, and it never could have. What the episode actually did was take a firm side on one specific feeling, the feeling that the law's protection should never depend on who a person happens to be, and it made that one feeling impossible to ignore by placing it in the mouth of a kid who had just been shot and then watched his shooter stroll away, free. There is something else the episode quietly captured about the moment it landed in. The country was discovering, all at once, how differently two people could watch the very same event and come away certain of opposite truth. Families split at the dinner table. Old friends stopped speaking to each other. The same footage, the same facts, the same verdict produced one story in one household, and the complete opposite story in the house next door. South Park has always understood that kind of split better than almost anything else on television, television, the way a single event can shatter into a dozen different versions depending on who is doing the telling. By filtering the whole tragedy through Cartman's broken mind, the show made a small, sharp point about that shattering. Nearly everyone in the story was reacting to a version of events built mostly out of their own fears and their own assumptions, and almost nobody was looking clearly at the actual people in front of them. The episode never pretends to know how to fix any of this, and that refusal is its own kind of honesty. It does not end with a tidy speech that ties the paint up in a neat bow or a lesson that sends everyone home feeling comfortable again. It simply lays the ugliness bare, the fear and the unfairness both, and trusts the audience to keep wrestling with it long after the credits roll. A safer, softer show would have reached for a warm and comforting moral at the end. This one chose to leave the wound wide open because the wound in the real country was still wide open, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie. For the young people watching at home, this episode asked the very heaviest question in the whole series, and it asked that question without offering any comforting answer in return. They were growing up in a country that was still arguing about exactly this, about whether the people meant to protect everyone truly protected everyone, about whether a person's race quietly changed the way the rules came down on them. The episode taught them to look hard and long at that question, and to refuse the easy comfort of pretending it had already been solved and put away. It also handed them a warning about fear itself by showing precisely where fear leads once it curdles and hardens into hatred. Cartman's whole journey, from a single bad dream all the way to shooting a classmate, is a portrait of what happens when a person grows so afraid of an entire group of people that the fear stops making any sense and starts doing real harm. The lesson tucked deep inside all the discomfort was to stay suspicious of any fear that paints whole groups of people as monsters, and to stay just as suspicious of any system that seems to weigh some lives more heavily on the scale than it weighs others. Cartman is the thread that ties this episode to so many of the others in this story, and that is no accident at all. Across the years, whenever South Park wanted to show a system being gamed, it reached for Cartman, because Cartman is the character who always finds the lever. He found the lever in the harassment rule when he sued a classmate over a single insult. He found it in the hate crime law, even while that law was being used against him. He found it here in the stand your ground law, turning a rule about defending a life into a tool for taking one. Cartman is the show's way of testing every rule against its worst possible user. A rule that works only when good and honest people use it is a weak rule, and the show keeps handing its rules to the most dishonest person it owns, then quietly filming what breaks. In this episode, what breaks is the comforting belief that the law's protections fall on everyone the same way, and Cartman is the crowbar the show uses to pry that belief wide open. Lined up against every single case that came before it, this episode reaches the deepest and rawest version of the show's running idea about justice. The earlier stories had shown the system bending toward money, toward power, toward performance, and toward the strong standing over the weak. This one strips the question all the way down to its most painful core, down to whether the justice system values every life equally and applies its protections in the same way to every single person. And in its blunt, deeply uncomfortable way, the show answers that the protection is conditional, that it seems to depend entirely on who is doing the asking. The pattern that has run through all of these cases tightens to its hardest and most painful point right here. The law makes a loud promise to treat everyone the same, and then it quietly hands its mercy to some people while withholding that very same mercy from others, and the enormous gap between that promise and that practice is exactly where the deepest pain in the country lives. The thread connecting all of this still holds firm. From a courtroom won entirely by confusion, to a flood of lawsuits that ate a whole town alive, to a child nearly imprisoned for years over a single thrown rock, to children seized from a home at gunpoint, to ordinary kids handcuffed for downloading a song, to a person trapped forever by fine print he never read, to athletes who did all the work and were never paid a cent, to a government that watched everyone in total secret. The show has kept circling one stubborn truth as it sees it. The system loudly claims fairness, and then quietly delivers something else entirely. With this episode, the show finally aimed that idea at the single most sensitive nerve in the entire country, at the question of whether the law truly treats every life as equally worth protecting, and it flatly refused to look away from the hard answer it found waiting there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There was still one more piece of the justice system that the show had not yet dragged onto the stand. Over the years, it had gone after lawyers, courts, laws, contracts, spies, and verdicts one after another. The last piece, the one standing right out in the open on every street corner in America, was the part that actually carries the law out into the world, the police. In its next strike, South Park would tell the story of an entire town that, after one of its own officers shoots a minority child, decides it has finally had enough and gets rid of its whole police force, and then has to discover the hard way exactly what a place quietly becomes once the people who were meant to protect it simply pack up and walk away for good. Section 10. The town that fired its police by 2015, South Park had changed the way it told its stories, stringing whole seasons together into one long thread instead of standing alone from week to week. Its 19th season was built around the rise of a new kind of person in town, a school principal so obsessed with being correct and proper about every social issue that he had turned good manners into a kind of weapon. And the season was airing right in the middle of one of the most painful national arguments America had faced in years. It was an argument about the police. For more than a year, the country had been shaken by a string of cases in which police officers killed people, many of them black, many of them unarmed. A teenager in Missouri, a man on a street in New York, a 12-year-old boy in Ohio, a man in Baltimore. Each name added to growing list, and each one brought more grief, more protest, and more fury into the streets. The same movement that had grown out of the verdict from a couple of years earlier swelled larger, and the whole country was locked in a hard and bitter fight about whether the police could be trusted, whether they needed to change, and what should be done about the killing. Many demanded reform, better training, and real accountability. A small and growing number of voices had begun to float a far more radical idea that some places might be safer with far fewer police, or with none at all. That idea would explode into a huge national argument years later, though in 2015 it still lived mostly on the edges. South Park reached out, grabbed that edge idea, and ran the whole experiment to its end on screen, imagining a town that actually does it, and then living inside the messy, ugly aftermath the slogans never mention. It helps to know what kind of season this episode lived inside. The 19th season was built around a single running idea, the rise of a movement in town, obsessed with being correct and sensitive about every issue under the sun. The new principal of the school was the leader of it, a loud, muscle-bound man who treated being politically correct like a contact sport and bullied anyone who stepped out of line. The whole season was poking at a real argument happening in the country at the time, a fight over how much people should watch their words, over whether all the new rules about what could and could not be said were making the world kinder or just making people better at pretending to be kind. This episode takes that season-long question and aims it straight at the police crisis. The town does not approach the killings the way someone seriously trying to fix a problem would. It approaches them the way the season's whole cast approaches everything, as a chance to look correct and feel superior. So the episode reaches past policing towards something larger, the gap between truly caring about an injustice and merely wanting to be seen as the kind of person who cares, which is the exact gap the entire season had been prying open week after week. The story kicks off with a false alarm at the elementary school. The police are called in for an emergency, and a squad of officers, including the town's longtime bumbling cop, Officer Barbrady, storms the building expecting real danger. They burst into the gymnasium, weapons ready, only to learn that the whole emergency was a fake, called in by the overzealous principal to remove a young girl who had done nothing more than talk to a friend. In the confusion of that pointless raid, Barbrady's gun goes off, and he accidentally shoots a Latino child. A bungling old cop, charging into a danger that was never real, ends up hurting an innocent kid for no reason at all. The town's reaction is swift and loud. Officer Barbrady is fired on the spot. The mayor tells him that he does not belong anywhere in a town as forward-thinking and proper as South Park has become. And here the show plants the first of its sharp little needles, because Barbrady, for all his foolishness, has long been shown as the one decent cop in town, the one who is not cruel and not racist, just clumsy and slow. Rather than single out a genuinely bad officer to punish, the town grabs the one harmless old man it has and throws him out, because throwing him out feels good and looks good and lets everyone believe they have done something brave. From there, the town takes us a far bigger step. Swept up in their own sense of being more enlightened than everyone else, the citizens decide they do not need a police force at all. South Park declares itself the very first American town to get rid of its cops, and the people plan to throw a giant celebration, a carnival, to honor how advanced and how good they have become. They are not mourning a child who got hurt. They are throwing a party for themselves, congratulating one another on their own goodness, treating the whole thing as a chance to feel superior rather than as a problem to actually solve. What happens next is where the episode turns truly dark and truly honest. The remaining officers, the ones who were not fired, do not vanish quietly. The townspeople begin to torment them, pushing shopping carts into them, spray paint in their cars, sneering at them in the street, treating every cop as a villain no matter what that cop has actually done. And the police, stung and bitter, hit back in the pettiest way they can. They stop helping. When ordinary people call for aid, the officers simply ignore the call, letting trouble go unanswered, punishing the whole town for the insults by withdrawing the one thing they were supposed to provide. Both sides dig in, and the people stuck in the middle are the ones who needed help and now cannot get any. A second second problem grows in the gap the missing police leave behind. A fancy new part of town, recently built up and shown off, fills with homeless people who have nowhere else to go. Without any police around, the town has no idea what to do about them, and the citizens who had just been celebrating their own kindness reveal something ugly. They treat the homeless not as people in need, but as garbage cluttering up their nice neighborhood, wrinkling their noses and complaining about the mess. The same crowd that had thrown a party over how much they cared turns out to care very little about the actual suffering people right in front of them. The episode builds its trap with patience, one quiet step at a time, so that by the end, the town has talked itself into something monstrous without ever once noticing. It begins with a real and reasonable feeling, the discomfort of watching a child get shot. From there, each step seems almost sensible on its own. Fire the officer who did it. Question whether the police are doing more harm than good. Decide the town would be better off without them. Throw a celebration of how far the town has come. None of those moves looks insane by itself, which is exactly how the show coaxes the audience into nodding along right up until the floor drops out. Then the consequences arrive, the ignored calls for help, the growing misery in the streets, the rising fear, and the town that felt so righteous a moment ago goes scrambling back toward the very thing it threw away. The flat, matter-of-fact way the show stacks these steps is what makes the ending land. Nobody in town ever cackles like a villain or announces a wicked plan. They simply keep making one understandable choice after another, each a little worse than the last, until they end up somewhere genuinely cruel and call it progress. Meanwhile, the boys, led by Kenny, have been running around playing a game of ninjas, dressing up and sneaking through that same rundown part of town. With the town already on edge and frightened, the sight of cloaked figures slipping through the shadows sparks a full-blown panic. People become convinced that the ninja kids are not kids at all, but agents of a feared foreign terrorist group, and terror sweeps through South Park. Suddenly, the town that had so proudly thrown away its protectors is desperate to feel safe again. The fear of an outside threat does in a few hours what no argument about fairness ever could. It makes the people want their police back. The way the town brings the police back is the cruelest and most truthful beat in the whole episode. Randy, one of the loudest adults, manipulates the fired Bar Brady into going after the kids everyone believes are terrorists, and in the chaos, another child, a boy named David, ends up shot while Randy quietly pins the blame on Bar Brady to keep his own hands clean. Then the police are welcomed back into town, though not on the promise that they will be gentler or fairer or more careful. They are welcomed back on a quiet, sickening agreement. The police can go right back to rounding up and beating the homeless and the powerless, just as long as nobody has to watch them do it. The town kept right on wanting what it had always wanted, and the only thing it changed was whether it would have to look. That single idea is the whole point of the episode, and it is a heavier point than it first looks. The town's anger about police violence was never really about the violence. It was about how the violence made them feel about themselves. They got rid of the police to look good, to feel pure, to throw a party in honor of their own kindness. The moment that decision cost them anything, the moment it became inconvenient and scary, they reached straight back for the police and the brutality they had supposedly hated, asking only that it be hidden from view so they could keep feeling good. Their concern was a costume. Underneath it, they wanted the exact same thing they always had, which was their own comfort, kept clean and out of sight. The show had a precise name for the thing it was mocking. The name was false empathy, the performance of caring put on for an audience. Real empathy costs something. It means sitting with a problem that is uncomfortable, giving up some comfort, doing the slow and thankless work of actually changing how things run. False empathy costs nothing. It is loud, it is public, it feels wonderful, and it vanishes the instant the bill comes due. The town of South Park overflows with false empathy. The citizens feel deeply, weep openly, and announce their goodness at the top of their lungs, right up until caring would require them to give something up or look at something painful. Then the feeling evaporates, and the same people who marched and celebrated go right back to wanting the homeless swept away, and the unpleasant work done quietly by someone else. The show does not claim that nobody should care about police violence. It claims that caring out loud and caring for real are two very different things, and that a crowd can do an enormous amount of the first while doing almost none of the second. This is the part of the episode that needs careful and fair handling, because police violence and how to respond to it remain things people argue about honestly and deeply. Many believe the killings of those years proved that policing in America is broken and demands serious change. Others believe that the police do a hard and dangerous job, that most officers are decent, and that tearing them down would leave ordinary people unprotected and unsafe. South Park aimed past both sides of that fight at something they could all recognize and dislike: the hollowness of people who treat a deadly serious problem as a chance to perform their own goodness without ever doing the hard real work of fixing anything. The show went after fake caring, the kind that is loud in public and empty in private. The townspeople are the target here, far more than the police. case. The episode shows a crowd that wants the feeling of justice without the cost of it. They want to be seen as good, to wave the right signs and say the right words and throw the right party, while the actual people who are suffering, the hurt child, the homeless, even the harmless old cop they scapegoated, get treated as props in a play about how wonderful the town is. When the curtain falls and the cameras turn away, the cruelty simply goes back to where it was, only quieter now, tucked into a corner where the good people of South Park will not have to look at it. Barbrady carries the saddest thread in all of it. Once he is fired, the town does not just let him go. He becomes unable to find any other work because everyone still sees him as a cop and wants nothing to do with him. He loses his home and ends up on the street among the very homeless people the town is busy sneering at. The one genuinely harmless figure in the whole story, the slow old man who never meant anyone harm, gets ground up and thrown away so that everyone else can feel pure. He is the price the town pays for its show of goodness, and the town pays it without a second thought. There is a strange tenderness in how the show treats Barbrady, which is rare for a series this merciless. For years, he had been a punchline, the dim cop who could barely read in the early seasons, the butt of 100 jokes. Here, in the middle of all the noise, the show pauses to feel sorry for him. It lets the audience watch a harmless old man lose everything, his job, his home, his dignity, for one reason only, that the town needed someone to throw away. The choice to make the scapegoat sympathetic is deliberate and pointed. A town clearing out a truly dangerous, hateful officer would be doing something good. A town destroying its most harmless member to feel pure is doing something else entirely. And by making sure the audience cares about Barbrady, the show makes sure the audience feels exactly how hollow the town's victory really is. For the people watching, this episode taught the sharpest and most grown-up lesson in the entire series, and it was a lesson aimed squarely at the viewer's own heart. It warned against the kind of caring that exists only to be seen. It asked hard questions that have no comfortable answer. When people raise their voices about justice, do they want the problem solved, or do they want to be admired for caring about it? When a fix turns out to be expensive or frightening or inconvenient, how quickly do the loud voices go quiet? The episode pushed its audience to be suspicious of easy righteousness, including their own, and to notice the difference between actually helping a suffering person and merely performing concern from a safe distance. It was a hard mirror for any show to hold up, and South Park held it without once blinking. The episode never lets the audience off the hook as innocent bystanders simply watching a town behave badly. It hands every person the same quiet question the show had been asking the entire time, whether the loud, righteous feeling of caring about something has slowly taken the place of the slow, unglamorous, often invisible work of actually doing something real about it. This is the last piece of the justice system the show ever put on trial in this run of cases, and it is the right note to end on, because it reaches past the system itself and points at the people who make it. Every case before this one showed the machinery failing, a courtroom won by confusion, lawsuits that ate a town, a child nearly jailed over a rock, children seized at gunpoint, kids handcuffed over song, a man trapped by fine print, players never paid, a government watching in secret, a verdict that split the country. In every one of those, it was easy to point at the system and say the machine is broken. This final case quietly removes that comfort. It suggests the machine keeps running the way it does because of what the people feeding it actually want. The town did not have a broken police force forced upon it by some distant power. The town built exactly the arrangement it secretly desired, cruelty kept out of sight, comfort kept safe, and a clean public face laid over the top of all of it. What makes this the right place to end is that it pulls the whole argument up out of the courtrooms and the laws and the headlines and rests it back where it truly lives, in ordinary people. For more than 15 years, the show kept showing the justice system failing, and it would have been easy to walk away thinking the trouble was simply bad judges, greedy companies, or broken rules. This final case refuses that easy exit. It shows a town that had the power to build whatever kind of justice it wanted and built a comfortable lie instead. No faraway villain forced the people into cruelty. They chose it, then dressed it up, then hid it, then threw a party about how good they were. If the system is a reflection of the people who run it and the crowd that cheers it on, then the failures traced through all 10 of these stories are choices made over and over by people who would rather feel just than be just. That is the quiet, uncomfortable thing the show had been building toward the entire time. That brings the whole story to its hardest truth. Across every episode in this run, the show kept insisting that the justice system claims fairness while delivering something else, that it serves power, money, performance, self-image far more than it serves the truth. With this final episode, the show turns the camera around and shows where that something else comes from. It comes from people. The system runs uneven because the people running it and the people cheering it on want it uneven in ways they will not admit, even to themselves. The courtroom rewards the better performer because the audience prefers a good show. The law bends toward money because the people with money built it that way. The cruelty stays hidden because the comfortable would rather not see it than end it. The machine is a mirror, and the reflection is not flattering. Cartman had been the show's favorite tool for revealing all of this. The worst person in town set loose to find the lever in every rule, but this last episode widens the lens far past any single villain. The villain here is the whole town, the ordinary, decent-seeming people, the ones who throw the party and wave the signs and then quietly approve of the very thing they marched against, as long as it happens where they cannot see it. That kind of villain is far more uncomfortable than any monster like Cartman could ever be, because the villain is no longer one rotten person but the crowd itself, and the crowd, the show seems to suggest, includes the people watching at home. 10 cases, 15 years, one cartoon staring down the courts, the laws, the police, and the people underneath them all. A lawyer who won by making no sense, a town that sued itself into ruin, a rock that cost a kid 13 years, children dragged from a home, kids cuffed over a song, a button nobody reads, players who rich for everyone but themselves, an eye that watched the whole country, a verdict that split the nation, a town that fired its protectors, then begged them back. 10 different stories, all chipping at one idea, and what remains is the sum of it. What a show this crude and this fearless spent all those years trying to say about fairness, about power, and about the machine every society builds and then calls justice. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.